Well, hey everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. So excited for your company. Really glad that you're here. My name's Duncan. I'm the director of the Further Faster network here in the UK and Ireland, and I'm here with Andy Stanley, who's the lead pastor of North Point Community Church. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning, Duncan. Thanks for inviting me to the show. This is exciting.
Oh, it's fantastic. Where are you talking to us from? Is that your lounge or is that your office? We can see
my lounge. No, this is actually my office. And once COVID took over the world, we pretty much turned it into a little studio. So this is my office at the office at our office building, not at home.
Okay, well, it's lovely. It's really nice.
Well,
So we're really glad of your company, and thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to our leaders.
Yeah.
So people are joining us primarily from the UK and Ireland, leaders and pastors of churches, but also from around the globe. I know we've got people listening in Australia and South Africa and Mexico and some other places. In fact, why don't you, if you're just joining us, welcome. Why don't you just say hi in the chat and tell us where you're tuning in from. Andy and myself would love to know where you're tuning in from. So drop that into the chat. Becky's on our call as well. She's our digital lead at Further Faster, and she's helping us to monitor that chat. So if you've got any questions as we go through today, drop those questions in the chat as well. You can also follow this conversation on all the socials using Andy Stanley Leadership Webinar as your hashtag, and you can ask your questions there as well. And before we dive into talking to Andy, I want to ask you, if you're listening to this today, to stick around until the end, because I've got something very special for you and you're not going to want to miss out on it. Andy and his team have been very generous in helping us, so you want to stick around for that. But Andy, before we dive into some questions, I just honestly want to say to you, thank you for your leadership by example, really, during this pandemic. I mean, your posture as a leader, the language you use have been so helpful to us. Those teaching series you did very early on back last year, leading through and better for it, our pastors have devoured that and repurposed it in their churches. And if you're listening and you're wondering about those series, you can find them on YouTube. But also the way you talked about suspending your in-person services, the language you use there, not out of a sense of fear, but out of a sense of love for your church, but primarily for your community as well. So we're really grateful for that. And even those fabulously funny videos you did with your wife, Sandra, they just set a tone. I mean, did they go down well at North Point?
Yeah, then, she and I, we laugh a lot, and so we don't want to overdo that, but those have been fun, and we do not take ourselves seriously at all, maybe to a fault. So that's really us. So I appreciate the fact you brought those up. Anyway, thanks, Duncan.
They're great, thank you. Let me dive in with some questions then. So you guys went exclusively online as a church around about a year ago this month. What's the journey been like, Andy, this past year, and where are you now with in-person services and online?
Well, we are slowly reopening we have 10 or 11 churches around the Atlanta area, metro Atlanta area. It's about 6.5 million people, metro Atlanta. And so we're slowly opening. One of the things we decided early on is as we began to open, stepping back a little bit, we wanted to make sure we stayed connected with children, middle school and high school students. That was our emphasis, rather than trying to get adults back in the building immediately. And so we were very proactive about that, intentional about that, and asked the question, hey, adults who want to come back to church, they're going to drift back in eventually, hopefully, but we don't want to lose the next generation. And that's, the question I ask leaders all the time is, what is the faith of the next generation worth? And I say the answer is everything, whatever we as grownups have to do to keep the next generation engaged. So we prioritize children, middle school and high school students, and college students as well throughout the pandemic. So back in the fall, we began reopening some environments for middle school and high school and then children. And we're just now moving adults back into our buildings on Sundays. And after Easter Sunday, I think we're going to be fully open, come one, come all. So that's sort of the back end of the answer to your question. On the front end, there were some other things we did, and we can talk about that if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I just think there's a moment there for all of our pastors in the UK to learn the priority of kids and youth. We can say that we prioritize the next generation, but unless we act in a way that demonstrates that, it's meaningless. So to actually say we're going to open our buildings for kids and for students before we start opening it for adults. I think that says so much. And I think that's a learning point for all of us.
Well, what happened is, I have lots of friends who are pastors, and because of the pressure from adults, and in the United States, and perhaps the UK as well, the pandemic has been so politicized. And of course, we just went through an election year, so politicized. And pastors in the United States have felt this because, we try to lead down the middle, not lukewarm in the middle. We get accused of that all the time, but down the middle of, we want to create churches unchurched people love to attend. Somebody asked Michael Jordan years ago, why aren't you more political? And his answer was, because Republicans buy shoes too. In other words, I have an agenda. My agenda is to sell shoes, and I want to sell them to both sides. Well, the gospel is for every political affiliation. So, Republicans and Democrats need Jesus too. So in terms of creating a church for unchurched people, to go off in either direction politically speaking within the context of the U.S., I think is a bad move. So consequently, a lot of churches felt pressure politically, get back to work, get back to church, open the churches, don't give in to the left-wing agenda. We won't get into all that. But we said, no, we are going to prioritize students and children, which means we're going to postpone bringing adults back into our building. So there was some, so what happened, my point was, a lot of great pastors, great churches around the US, Atlanta specifically, opened immediately for adults. And they didn't offer children's ministries on purpose. They said, we're not going to offer children's ministries, but bring your adults. We did the opposite. We said, no, bring your children, then you go sit in the parking lot or watch online. So we kind of reversed that. And now that we're on the backside of this, that is paying dividends primarily because we have kept, especially middle school and high school students, engaged with the local church. And what is the faith of the next generation worth? Well, it's worth everything. So to say that we made some sacrifices within the broad context of people in the world making sacrifices, they weren't real sacrifices, but we certainly switched up or changed our model for the sake of our mission. And Duncan, you've heard me say, marry your mission, date your model, marry the mission, date the model. Models come and go, make disciples, that's indisputable. So we abandoned portions of our model for the sake of our mission. And to your point, saying the next generation is important is one thing, but the pandemic, I think for all churches, the pandemic tested our commitment to our mission. And were we willing to abandon or set aside parts of our model in order to stay true to our mission? So this is just my opinion. The churches that in the US that rushed back to adult services, in spite of how dangerous it was, and in spite of the fact that they couldn't invite outsiders and invite the community, to me, I feel like they gave up a little mission because they were so married to the model being we've got to be shoulder to shoulder in a building on Sunday morning, singing songs and hearing sermons. So that's just, sort of our thinking throughout this past 18 months or so, or 12 months.
12 months. That's been so helpful, Andy. Thank you for that. I'm just interested. Can I be a little bit personal with you here? I mean, how did you get some pushback from people in your church saying, we want the building open? How did you cope with that as a pastor?
Families left our church, and I would get emails. And here's how I handle that. If it was, when I get negative feedback on social media, letters, email, voicemail, whatever, the first thing I do is my assistant, Diane Grant, she checks to see, is this person involved in our church and how involved are they? So for the people who were actually involved and not just outside naysayers, I called them on the phone, every single one of them. Wow. Because I genuinely care. I don't want anyone to leave our church. And also I was so curious, what in the world, because these people would say things like, Andy, we came 8 years ago, 10 years ago, you saved our marriage, you helped our kids, we love the church, but we are leaving. And I'm like, okay, why? You just gave me reasons why you should stay. And in 90% of the cases, it was political. They felt like you've given in to government pressure. I'm like, no, we haven't. In the state of Georgia where we live, there was no government pressure to shut down. We were trying to be good neighbors and good neighbors to the neighborhoods by not being a super spreader. And I don't know if you want to get into this. What I said to our staff early on, I said, we're not taking our foot off the pedal. We're going to redeploy. Now that we're not having to get ready for here comes Sunday, here comes Sunday, here comes Sunday, here comes Sunday, let's redeploy our energy into the community and ask the question, what can we do? Let's don't get stuck on what we can't do. Let's ask the question, in light of this new world, what can we do? And we were able to do more in and for our communities than ever. So again, you set aside portions of your model from time to time for the sake of the mission. And people left. Some people were angry. Again, I tried to call every single family who I could track down, people who had been involved. And, the conversations generally ended well, and time will tell as to whether or not they decide to come back. And what was kind of funny, Duncan, is, we're leaving the church. And this was early on when all the churches were shut down. I said, well, this is actually a great time to leave our church because, well, there's no other church to go to. And they'd kind of laugh, but so I listen to my critics. There's always something to learn from criticism. Yeah. You have to keep it within context, but I'm just naturally curious. And when somebody gets that angry, I'm curious. I mean, there's something behind that. So
Andy,
it's been interesting.
Yeah. And I love that because, again, a person in your position, you've got quite a big staff. You could get all your staff to make those calls, but you decided to pick up the phone. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall when the phone rang and it's, hey, it's Pastor Andy here, and people going, no, you're kidding me.
Well, that's what happened. On multiple occasions, it's like they weren't sure it was really me because, you fire off an angry email or an angry tweet. It's like, okay, out of sight, out of mind, we're gone. In fact, I bet 25-30% of the emails I got started with, I realize no one will probably ever read this. That's how they started. It's like, wow, you're so big and distant, and I'm like, I read it and I got your phone number. Hey, let's chat. And then, people kind of gear down a little bit. So
yeah. No, I love that. I mean, there's another lesson for us as leaders there about the importance of getting personal in a very digital age, going old school and picking a telephone up and using it not to text or to message, but actually to phone somebody. Brilliant. Listen, can I talk to you about change? Because obviously we've all had to change massively in these past 12 months or so,
right,
with our buildings being closed. What kind of changes as a preacher, as a pastor, have you had to negotiate, struggled with? How have you changed how you've done ministry personally?
Well, two things. One, we just touched on, and one of the messages series that you referenced, the Leading Through series, one of the things that was convicting to me that I found myself talking about was in times of crisis, our voice is more important than our words. And so I began calling people in situations where normally I would text or maybe email, because I realized in times of uncertainty, people need to hear our voice, that our presence is more important than our preparation. And I am such a stickler for preparation. I tend not to wade into something till I'm fully prepared. Well, in times of crisis, forget preparation. You just got to show up. Anybody who does pastoral ministry understands that. You're walking into a hospital room and there are no answers. There are no words that are going to change the emotion or dynamic, but you just have to show up anyway. So that was one of the things I told one of our pastors yesterday. We were on a conversation and I even said that. I said, I have made more pastoral phone calls this year than probably the last 5 years before, because of the nature of what's going on. And it's a lesson for me. I tend to, pull back. The other big change, and maybe some of the communicators in your audience will appreciate this. When we quit meeting, we continued to create sermons, or I did. In the first 2 or 3 weeks, I tried to preach to a camera the way I normally did and hated it, dreaded it. So I switched and I began scripting my entire sermon and reading the sermon off a teleprompter. So those two series that you mentioned, I am looking right into a screen under a camera, 50, 30, 40 feet away. And I'm reading those entire messages. And I learned, again, I had to pivot, abandon my preaching model for the sake of, new realities. I wanted everybody in my audience was on the other end of a piece of glass. They weren't over here and up there anymore. And so I tried to tailor my communication style to, the context. So we changed the way we preached, the way we captured music, everything. So, and going forward, like everybody in your audience, you got smart folks watching and listening. You realize, hey, we're going to carry some of this forward. So that's one of the great things. I'm not discounting the pain and the suffering, the funerals. We did multiple funerals in this past year, weddings. We've had deaths. We've had, COVID has just ransacked our entire staff to some extent. So, we've all learned some things, and, now we got to figure out how to carry the good things forward and not just get back into the old rhythm and forget these learnings.
Yeah. That's really helpful. Thank you. Can we talk strategy for a moment? And I know for every pastor who's listening to this, we're all thinking in pencil right now. No one is writing anything in ink because no one's quite sure what's around the corner.
Yeah.
But I've heard rumors that you're beginning to tentatively put together a new strategy to reach unchurched people and keep your core connected. And I'd love you to talk about that. But before you do, tell us why you've come to this new strategy. I mean, I heard you a while ago talk about this idea of you used to be baristas and now you want to become missionaries. Talk about why you've changed your strategy. What was all that about?
Yeah, well, and Duncan, please, we don't know each other. So at whatever point my answers are too long, just say, thank you, Andy, let's move on. Okay. I want this to serve your audience, not just listen to me talk. Yeah. So, when we began our church, we were kind of the only hot dog stand in town. So if you wanted hot dogs, you didn't have any choice. So we grew quickly, we multiplied quickly. Well, 10, 12 years ago, those days kind of came to an end because everybody was doing church a new way. We weren't, the only hot dog stand in town, so to speak. But unfortunately, we had settled into what as you said, I call a barista mindset, where we're just standing behind the counter serving up hot cups of ministry. We don't have to think about the community. We don't have to we don't have to think like missionaries. We're just like in retail, just come one, come all, and we'll shuffle you around and expand and build buildings. So, when I came back to North Point Community Church as the lead pastor, I said, okay, we have to get out of that mindset. And we're a big church. We don't have to worry about it. We have financial margin. There's no pressure to get this right. But as a leader, I want to get this right. And I don't want to be lulled into, thinking since we're not feeling pressure, there's not real pressure out there. One of my favorite books, I think just because of the title, by Andy Groves. He was the CEO or almost kind of, I guess, one of the founders of Intel. He passed away a few years ago. He wrote a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. Only the Paranoid Survive. I love the title of that book. So as leaders, there should always be a sense of paranoia of what's out there, what's coming, what am I not anticipating? So I began a move 2.5 years ago to get us out of this barista mindset and to begin to think and act like missionaries, not because we had to, but because we're called to, right? Sure. And, we're the church that prides ourselves in being the church unchurched people love to attend. So I started pushing, and what I realized was, as is the case for all the pastors out there, there is a natural, predictable flow as to how people hear about your church, are invited to your church, what they experience in your church, and then the systems on the back end you have to get them involved in your church. So they hear about it, they're invited to it, they experience it, and then they get involved. Well, that's pretty much the natural flow of every local church. But I realized this happened automatically, and this happened, this was just how it happened. But we didn't have words for that. And the problem is, in any organization, if you don't have words around what's working, when it stops working or when it stops working as well, number one, you don't notice it because you're not evaluating it and you can't fix it. And by the time you realize it's broken, if you don't know why it's working, the other way I say it is this: if you don't know why it's working when it's working, you won't know how to fix it when it's broke. So I felt like we needed to take this natural rhythm of church life and put words around it. And so when I presented this to our staff, I told them, I said, this is not a change. This is what you are already doing and doing well. But we need some words so we can measure it. In every healthy organization, there's a rhythm of what I call orchestration, evaluation. Orchestration, evaluation. Orchestration is, this is how we do it here for now. Evaluation is, how can we make that better? So the people who show up at our churches or our church environments, there needs to be a sense of predictability, but predictability can become a rut. It can become an old couch that we move around from house to house that we don't realize is ugly, but everybody that walks into our house wonders, why do they have that old couch in this house, right? So orchestration, evaluation, orchestration, evaluation. Well, you can't evaluate what you haven't clearly orchestrated. So this strategy shift was not so much a shift in what we do, is I decided we needed new words around what was happening so that we could measure it, staff it, and fund it. And this goes back to what I said originally. And part of these new words, was to remind us that we are not baristas standing behind a counter because we can barely get everybody in. We really do have to have an outward facing mindset in the community because we are here for unchurched people. So that's kind of the backdrop for why I added these words to our kind of corporate papers or corporate documents.
Yeah, well, I'd love you to go ahead and talk about that, because I've got a bit of a mole on the inside on your staff, and he was telling me he'd sat in a staff meeting with you just recently, and you'd outlined these new words, this new strategy. Would you be kind enough to share that with us?
Oh yeah,
I know you're just still, the paint's still very wet on this, and you're still shaping it. But
yeah, this specifically, this took about a year or maybe more of discussions. I'm a Enneagram 1, so I want everything to be perfect, which good luck in the world, right? For those of you who are into Enneagram. But here's what I learned a long time ago. Well, actually, Howard Hendricks, who was a professor of mine in seminary, said this, talking about preaching specifically. He said, if it's a mist in the pulpit, it will be a fog in the pew. Wow. If it's a mist, in other words, if the preacher is a little bit unclear, if it's a mist in the pulpit, it's a fog in the pew. Well, organizationally, the same thing is true. If it's a little bit misty, what we're trying to do at the corporate level or at the board level or at the pastoral level, well, by the time it gets to the people in our church, they just hope we've got it figured out. So, we have just recently gone round and round and round with this language till I feel like we finally got it right. So here are kind of the big pieces. And I took this natural process that, again, happens in every church, and we boiled it down to 3 phrases. And the first one was really the one that's most important right now and was most important during COVID. And it's the piece we did not have language around as an organization. And it's endear your community. Endear your community. And the second piece is inspire your audience. And the third piece is equip your core. So it's endear the community, inspire your audience, equip the core. So by endear the community, this is the language under it is simply this. We want the people in our community to know we're here, to be glad we're here, and to be better off because we're here. We want them to know that the church is here. We want them to be glad the church is here. And we want them to be better off because the church is here. In other words, you've probably heard me say this before, Duncan, the local church the reputation of the local church should be, I'm not sure I buy what they believe, but I'm glad they're here. I'm not sure I believe all of that, but I hope my daughter marries one. I hope my son marries one. I'd like to hire them, and I love to work for them. In other words, these are the finest people in the community, and they believe some strange things. Somebody rose from the dead. I don't get that. But in terms of being a neighbor or in my organization, they're the most honest people. So endearing the community, especially as culture shifts in the US to become more and more like what, has been a reality in most of Europe for, a long, long time. That piece is more important than ever. And during COVID, we loaded up on endearing the community. Inspire the audience. This goes directly back to our corporate mission statement, which is to inspire people to follow Jesus. That's our mission statement, to inspire people to follow Jesus by engaging them in the life and the mission of the local church. So that's, those are our marching orders. So when I say inspire the audience, I don't just mean rah, rah and music. That hangs underneath inspire people to follow Jesus. But when these inspire the audience, these are all our physical and digital environments. Anything that we create that people participate in, we want to inspire that group of people to follow Jesus. So those are your events, your experiences, worship service, children's ministry, small groups, anything where there's an audience, inspire the audience. And we've fleshed out specifically what we mean by that. In fact, the little statement under that piece is we want people to be glad they attended and plan to return. And the bonus is we want them to be glad they attended, plan to return, and bring a friend. That's when I set the bar pretty high, whether it's small group, worship service, children's environment, whatever it might be. And then the third piece, equip the core. This is the This is one of the most difficult things we do as church leaders, to get people who heard about us, showed up, experienced us, like it, to get them to take a step and to serve and to lead and to get engaged and to own the mission of the church. Because our mission isn't simply to inspire people, it's to inspire people to follow Jesus by engaging them in the life and the mission of the local church. So that's the win. When a person's heard about you, show up, they've gotten involved, and then they say, hey, I want to get more involved. I want to give, I want to serve, I want to lead, and hey, I want to be a raving fan in our community for this local church. So it's those three pieces: endear the community, inspire your audience, equip the core.
Andy, that's fantastic. It feels like we've got some marching orders here, and it feels like all of us as church leaders are thinking, yeah, they're the three things we need to focus on. So can I just go back to the endearing the community? Give us some examples. What have you been doing these past 12 COVID months where you've been trying to do stuff just to love on your local neighbors?
Well, we have made our facilities available to local municipalities and city government for COVID testing, vaccines. We've been a Red Cross, the American Red Cross site for people giving blood throughout this whole time. In fact, we just found out this 2 weeks ago that North Point Community Church, where I'm the current lead pastor, we were the #1 Red Cross blood site for the state of Georgia for all of 2020, by far. In other words, more people showed up to give blood at our church than any other site in our state, by far. And our church in town, Buckhead Church, was #5 in the state, and 2 other of our campuses were in the top 25. So again, looking for ways to endear the community through service. We do a fundraising event every year for the community called Be Rich. You may be familiar with that, where I basically ask everybody to give $39.95, and we give 100% of it away to local charities, faith-based and non-faith-based charities. We just find the best charities in our communities, and we say, what do you need? We're going to go raise the money for it. So I told our church, and this is kind of amazing, and yes, I'm bragging, so I'll just put that out there. We've not met for a year until 2 weeks ago as adults. So in September, when we did our Be Rich campaign, we moved it up earlier. I said to our church, look, we need to be more generous than ever because the needs are greater than ever. We generally raise about $5 million in 2 weeks for Be Rich. We raised almost $8 million this year. We raised more money not meeting in church together to give away to the communities than we ever have before. So those are the kinds of things that we focused on during this season, because again, we weren't having to prepare for here comes Sunday, all those things. So, and I could go on and on and on, but the point is, churches should ask the question, what can we do to make sure the community knows we're here, they're happy we're here, and they're better off that we're here. This just creates goodwill, and again, opens the door and softens people to what we're saying and why we're in the community. And I'm sure everybody in your audience, they're doing some of those things. We just decided we wanted to put words around it so we could measure it and make sure we didn't lose sight of it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It feels like it's about the reputation of the church in the community.
Yeah,
it feels like trying to put the church on the front page of the local newspaper for all the right reasons and not the wrong reasons.
For all the right reasons for a change, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let me push into that second one a little bit, if you don't mind. This inspire the audience. Would you say then you've shifted, because you talked about creating experiences that are, that have a bit of curb appeal online as well as in the room. So have you shifted a bit in your thinking about digital church and the role that has to play?
Yes. And we had been trying to figure this out for probably 4 years before COVID hit. What's the relationship between digital and physical? Does digital compete with physical? Yes. Does digital, can digital be a step to physical? Yes. The answer to all the questions is yes. You're familiar with the Home Depot. The former CEO of Home Depot is a part of our part of our church, and his name's Frank Blake. And Frank has been so helpful with this. He said, when the Home Depot first entered the digital domain to do online sales years ago, they had this same dilemma. Do we still need stores? Do we build fewer stores? What's the relationship between digital and physical? And he said the answer is yes. There is a relationship. And figuring out how to leverage the relationship appropriately and to create a sense of, if you do one, you really are part of the other, is ultimately the goal. So we've been trying to figure out, what is that marriage? How many resources do you allocate to that? So of course, COVID came along, and fortunately for us, we were set up to go exclusively digital because we had already entered that domain. So now coming out where people, hopefully because of a scarcity mentality, people will want to gather again and get their kids together again. We don't want to lose sight of what we've learned in the digital domain, but we are still wrestling with what is not the perfect balance. It's not a balance. It's how do we make sure these are synchronized, and how do we make sure they are working together to supplement, when people can't attend, or when people would rather have a conversation like this with people they can't drive to one another's homes, but these are the people they feel connected to. So we're still figuring some of that out.
Sure.
But we know digital is here to stay. Zoom is here to stay. Online gatherings are here to stay, but physical gatherings are here to stay as well. People need people, as we've learned during this, past 12 months.
It's going back to Jim Collins, isn't it? The genius of the and. It's both and. It's not one or the other. It's trying to find out to make it.
It is both and. It sure is. And can I just offer an opinion? I don't want to say it's advice. It's an opinion. And I'm sure you talk about this all the time, Duncan. For a local church, it's better to do a few things well than to do everything unwell or sort of half-baked. So when you think about your physical environments or your digital environments, if it's not something that really reflects your commitment to excellence and clarity, just don't do it yet. And I say that because in the past, we've tried some things that I looked at and said, it's good, it's not great. If that's somebody's introduction to who we are, I don't think that's a good introduction, So, tread lightly, pick a narrow piece of that and get really, really, really good at it. Own that space before you feel like you have to have something for everybody. In other words, you may have something that a digital opportunity for high school students, but not children, or children, but not high school students, or adults, but not family ministry. But whatever you do, physical, digital, do it well. Because again, that's the 4-year environment. That's people's first introduction or first experience with your local church. And, first impressions, they're pretty much everything.
Yeah. Andy, this is so releasing for some of us as pastors as well, because part of the fear is trying to do everything. We've been doing a year's worth of online and it's exhausted us. And now you're telling me I've got to do online and in the room. How am I going to do that together? So that's great advice. Thank you. Can I push on? We've talked strategy. Can I talk a bit about leadership with you? Because it's been tough for everybody. It's been tough for everybody, the COVID thing, but everybody in leadership, whether you're leading a family or whether you're leading a small business or whether you're leading a church or whether you're leading a nation, it's been really hard to make some calls because it's all been so uncertain. Give us some advice. How do you lead well in the midst of uncertainty when everything around is constantly shifting? You want to be clear, but it's really hard to be clear because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone next week.
Right. Well, yeah, this is the challenge of leadership. If this tension or challenge wasn't out there, there would be no need for leadership. This is what gives you tenure, and this is what gives you credibility as a leader, because people crave certainty. You cannot provide certainty ever. If you pretend to provide certainty, eventually that's going to undermine your leadership and your integrity. And the smart people in the room are going to know you're just making stuff up because you can't provide certainty. But what we can provide is an element or a level of clarity. And during times of uncertainty, clarity trumps certainty because certainty is not something we can provide. And during times of great uncertainty, like we're in right now or coming out of right now, the people who provide the most clarity will be perceived as the leaders because clarity feels like leadership. That's just what it feels like. So the way that rolls out, because you're right, there are areas where as leaders, we don't even know how to be clear. So here's what I've tried to do, what I've told our leaders to do and tell church leaders to do. Whereas you can't be clear about what's going to happen, you must be clear about what you want people to do. So you can't be certain about what's going to happen. You can't predict the future, but you must be clear on what you want people to do. And this is one of the reasons I saw some churches kind of spin in the wind for the first 6 or 7 months during COVID, because once things began to shut down, they sat back and they just waited. Like, we're just, I don't know what's going to happen, so we're just going to wait. Well, are we meeting Sunday? Well, I'll tell you on Monday. Are we meeting the next Sunday? Well, we're just going to go week by week. So we decided we're not doing that. First we announced we're not going to open for 3 weeks, then 6 months, and then we're not going to open until 2021. I just wanted to clear the decks to say, let me be clear. Let me be clear. Forget Sundays. Okay. We're not open. Now, here's what I want you to do in the meantime. So I tried to be very specific with what I wanted our staff to do, because clarity around what we want people to do feels like leadership. It is leadership, and it is most important when things are uncertain. When people feel like, oh, somebody has a plan, they've given me something specific to do, or asked me to do something specific, somebody's in charge, they're not sitting back feeling like they're a victim of things they have no control over. So clarity is king, especially during times of uncertainty.
I love that. And I love that idea of, it's hard to be clear about what's coming down the road. We're not sure. But in the meantime, I love that phrase. In the meantime, this is what I want you to do. Just these one or two little things. So there's clarity about what to do in the next hour or the next day, even if we haven't got clarity about what we're going to do next week. Fantastic. Right. That's so helpful, Andy. Thank you. Can I push on to another aspect of leadership here? This whole idea of decision making, because again, I talk to pastors in the UK and in Ireland all the time, and one of the hardest things they're having to do right now is to make decisions, and yet they're being called to make decisions all the time. Decisions about budgets, because obviously income is fluctuating and struggling. Decisions about staffing roles, how do we reallocate our staff? Decisions about reopening plans, about online programs, decisions about how we re-engage our families. We often feel like we've lost our families in this COVID thing. And leaders don't want to make the wrong decisions and then regret it down the road. Now, I've got this is your latest book, this Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And I'm so grateful for it. I'm grateful for it because it's only 99 pages. I read it in one sitting and scribbled.
Oh, wow.
It's fabulous. It's so
Sandra calls it my cute little book.
Yeah.
One of those videos that you were talking about. She says it's, and I was trying to hold it up close to the camera so it looked bigger, and she was pulling it back. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
It is very cute compared to Deep and Wide, which is a tone.
Right.
It's lovely and cute. It's great. But it's a brilliant book. But in the book, you talk about 5 questions people need to ask when they've got decisions to make. So I wonder whether you wouldn't mind taking us through those 5 questions and helping us see how they might apply to us as leaders with some of these huge decisions we're being asked to take right now.
Yeah, in fact, I've been encouraged to write another version of this book for leaders, and I don't know that that's necessary because, well, leaders are smart. They know how to take information and bring it into their context. So I don't think it's necessary. But all 5 of these questions are extremely important to leaders. The first question I call the integrity question. The integrity question is, am I being honest with myself? Really? Am I being honest with myself? Really? The most difficult person to lead always is the person in the mirror. 100% of the time. Yeah. And if as leaders, we're not honest with ourselves, then automatically our decisions are going to be just off by a few degrees. And as time goes by, it gets worse and worse and worse. So am I being honest with myself? Really is the first question. Why am I doing this? Really? Why am I saying this? Really? Why am I avoiding that meeting? Really? Why am I avoiding her? Really? Why do I get so angry? Really? Why am I so just learning to be honest with ourselves. You can't make a great decision if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. You just can't. So am I being honest with myself? Really, that's the integrity question. The second question is the legacy question. And I think this is one of my favorite in the book because it's what I have tried to load my kids up with. All my kids are in their 20s now. 2 of them are married. They're all out of the house, working, but growing up, decision-making was a big deal as a parent, teaching your kids how to make good decisions. So the legacy question is this: what story do I want to tell? What story do I want to tell? So bringing that within the context of leadership and specifically COVID, I've been saying to leaders the whole time, look, one day, COVID is just going to be a story we tell. Remember 2020? I mean, it's not going to be long. It's just a story we tell. So when you look back on how you handled this personally, with your family and with your leadership and your organization, your church, when this is just a story you tell, what story would you like to tell? Now decide accordingly. This is a really powerful question, because in the midst, as you just pointed out, Duncan, in the midst of decision-making, we are so in the moment. We forget one day, as bad as this is, or as good as something is, this is just a story I tell. So what story do I want to tell? Well, you want to be the hero in your story. You want it to be a story that inspires your kids and inspires people if they ever hear your story of how you navigated a divorce, how you navigated COVID, how you navigated a bankruptcy, how you navigated success, whatever it might be. So before I make the decision, okay, when this is nothing more than a story I tell, what story do I want to tell? So that's the legacy question. Then the conscience question is one I think probably all of us in leadership or pastoral leadership have talked about before to some degree. The conscience question is this: is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Every parent, every leader has faced this. You're about to make a decision, and in the pro column, there's all these reasons. Everybody does this. This is corporately what we do. This is what our industry does. This is what's expected of me. Everything looks good. Everybody's nodding. But as the leader or as the father or the mother, there's just something on the inside. You can't put your finger on it, but there's a hesitation. There's a tension. So whenever you're making a decision, if there's a tension, pay attention to that tension, that leadership intuition, that parental intuition, the Holy Spirit intuition, tapping on our conscience. That's why I call it the conscience question. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Don't brush by it. Don't rush by it. And the problem is oftentimes there's no information to back up that tension. So people think we're just being emotional. When I was growing up, my father's a pastor, he's 88. And, I would ask him a question or try to get him to let me do something. And he would say, well, I just have a check in my spirit. And I'm like, what is that? Check in your spirit. How do we even talk about that? I've just given you 25 reasons why you should let me do this. And on the other side of the ledger, you have a check in your spirit. I mean, it would drive me crazy. But of course, he was always right. And as time went by, it, how right he was would manifest itself. So sometimes we can't put our finger on it, but there's just a tension. Pay attention to that tension. Wait for it to go away or for new information to surface. And probably everybody watching today can think of a time when they didn't pay attention to that tension, made a decision, and then more information surfaced. And it's like, oh, I should have paid attention to that tension. The fourth question is the maturity question, something I've talked about for years. What is the wise thing for me to do? In light of my past experience, my current circumstances, my future hopes and dreams, what is the wise thing for me to do? Not the right thing, not the moral thing, not the legal thing, not what everybody else is doing. In light of my past experience, my current circumstances, my future hopes and dreams, what is the wise thing for me to do? And this is an organizational question. In light of where you've been organizationally, in light of what's going on right now organizationally, in light of what you want to see in the future organizationally, what is the wise thing to do right now? Again, this is a question my dad raised me on. It's a question I raised our kids on. It's a big part of our family ministry environment with children. We do Walking Wisely weekend. We teach kids, look, it's not about right and wrong. As Christians, we're called to walk wisely. If you draw the line right between right and wrong, you're living your life on the edge of financial, relational, moral, ethical disaster constantly. So the wisdom question gives us margin, gives us guardrails. And again, the Apostle Paul says, don't walk as unwise, but as wise men, making the most of the day, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Then the last question is different. The last question is the relational question. And as I say in the book, and as I say whenever I talk about this, if you ask those other four questions, you will benefit. Those four questions will benefit you. You'll be wiser. You'll stay out of trouble. You'll have a better legacy. You'll be honest with yourself. Pay attention to your conscience. Those four questions always benefit the person asking. The fifth question is different, the relational question. This one will cost you. 100% of the time it will cost you, and there may be no return on your investment. And the relational question is, what does love require of me? What does love require of me? This is at the epicenter of our experience and our call as Christians. And when I say love, I have a very, very, very narrow definition of love. And I get criticized for this sometimes. Andy thinks it's all about a love fest. We're just supposed to love each other. I'm like, you've never heard me say that, because Jesus defines this for us. And here's what he says as to his disciples, right before he's carted off and executed. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. That's the definition. And then the next day, he puts on a demonstration of love that takes his breath away and takes our sin away. That is the standard. That's why it always requires, not what, how can I love you? No, what does love require of me? Sometimes it requires money. Sometimes it requires humility. Sometimes it requires me giving up part of my reputation. Sometimes it requires me taking a risk relationally, because I've got to confront you with something that's hurting you, even though you may never speak to me again. What does love require of me? But that's what changed the world. And that's what differentiates Christianity from everything else in the world. And that's what should characterize us as Christians. And that's why our reputation in the community is so important, because remember what Jesus said next. He said, by this, all men will know that you're my disciples. Church attendance? No. Prayer life? No. Devotional life? No. How much scripture you've memorized? No. How big your church is? No. By this, all men will know that you're my disciple. If you love God, Jesus, if you love one another. It's so clear. And when we get that right personally as leaders, we're better leaders. When that is infused in the culture of our churches, we're better churches. And when that is played out in the community, we have more influence. What does love require of me? So those are the 5 questions the book is built around.
This is huge. Thank you for taking the time to talk about that. I mean, that last one is so powerful. And I love what you're talking about at the end there. If that becomes infused in our church culture, if we learn to love each other as staff, and we learn to love each other as team, and we learn to love each other as a family in the church, if it becomes part of our culture, then that's naturally going to spill out into our community, and our reputation will go out. You can't expect to go out there and build our reputation unless we can love each other inside.
And can I just say one more thing about that, Duncan? And I don't have any specific church in mind, but the thing that irritated me most during 2020, during the COVID crisis, was watching local churches get in what I call a spitting match with local municipalities, city councils, the mayor, the state. We're demanding our way. You can't keep us from worshiping. You can't keep us from gathering. And here's our opportunity to love our neighbors and love our neighborhoods. And churches went to war with local governments demanding their way so they could win. And so during this pandemic, I preached a message. I think it's the most important thing I've said in a while. The name of the message is "Not in it to win it." That the moment a Christian or a church, but a church in particular, the moment we position ourselves as trying to win something, we have already lost. Even if you win in court, you've lost. Even if you win with the city council, you've lost. If you get to stand up in front of the church and say, we went to war, we went to bat, we showed them, we won, you have lost. Because we are not to leverage the tools of the kingdoms of this world. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So we as Christians are not in it to win it. So the minute we position ourselves, win, lose, the church has already lost 100% of the time. And so watching churches lose credibility, lose influence, lose money, and in some cases lose lawsuits in an attempt to, we have religious liberty and you can't tell us what to do. I just thought, wow, what a missed opportunity. What does love require of us?
Thank you. And so
that's more than you asked for.
No, it's fantastic. But if you're listening to this, you'll know now why I think this book is so important, why I devoured it in one go, why I bought it for all the pastors in our network and sent it to them. And listen, if you're struggling, I mean, go ahead, go buy it and get it on Amazon. If you're struggling to find the $10 or whatever it is to buy it, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Andy, but you taught that in church, a whole series based on the book. And you can go online on YouTube and you can find it. So if you don't want to buy the book, you can listen to Andy teach it on YouTube.
Yeah, in fact, I am very cautious about using my position as a pastor to sell books or promote books. I don't even promote my books in our churches to a fault. My publisher's like, can you at least hold it up? I'm like, no, I don't do that. So, but I wanted to teach this content. So I said in the first 2 messages of the series, I said, look, I have a new book, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. You don't need to buy it because I'm going to teach you the whole thing over the next 5 weeks. So, and I was sincere about that. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Listen, I've got a way in which you can get Andy's book for free. I've got one more question to ask you, Andy, because our time is running out. But before I do, I said to you right at the start, if you're listening to this, that I wanted to give you an incredibly special offer that we're making as the Further Faster network. Andy's raised a whole bunch of different things over this call in the past hour. So we've put together a leadership cohort, a 3-month leadership cohort in April, May, and June. Andy has been very generous and allowed some of his staff to jump on those calls with us. And we want to invite you to be part of that cohort. And we'll have some resources to give you. We'll talk about some of the issues Andy's raised. We'll have some input from his staff, and you'll have a chance to meet with like-minded leaders who are on the same journey as you, trying to create a church that unchurched people love so much they keep coming back to. And like Andy says, even bring a friend to as well. So I want to invite you to come onto that leadership cohort. To sign up for it, you can do it at furtherfaster.network/leadership cohort. The cost of the leadership cohort for 3 months is exactly the same amount of money as you paid to get on this webinar, which is nothing, completely and utterly free. And Andy's been incredibly generous in that the first, I don't know if you realize this or not, Andy, but for the first 25 people who sign up and attend the cohort, you'll get a copy of Andy's book that you can, or you'll get a code so you can digitally download that book as well. So thank you for your generosity in doing that for us, Andy. But sign up for the cohort. We would love to help you take these next steps, because for us in the UK, you know, we're probably going to come out of lockdown in the next 3 or 4 months and start meeting again in person. So what we do now and how we plan for that now is so important. So we as a network just want to walk through that time with you. So sign up for those that leadership cohort. It's specifically for lead pastors, for ministers, leaders of churches. Yeah, I'd love you to be part of that if you can. Go ahead and do that right now. Andy, one last question, and our time's through. And I'm sure you've heard this question so many times before, but I speak to pastors in the UK and in Ireland all the time, and I get one word thrown back at me time and time again. Duncan, I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted. I'm tired. It's just really hard. If this is what church ministry is, I'm not sure I'd have signed up had I known about that in the first place. And so would you give us a little bit of hope, especially to those leaders who are exhausted? I know that some of the leaders I've been talking to recently, they're on the edge of throwing the towel in. They're on the edge of saying, I just want to go and get a job in a grocery store. I'm just so tired. What's your hope for the future of this beautiful thing called church? Help some of us who are thinking of jumping in a ditch and running away from it all.
Well, it is okay to hit pause and go get a job at a grocery store. No guilt. Okay. And I don't mean you're abandoning ministry. You're not. You know, you got to sharpen the saw. Sometimes you got to put the saw down and go sharpen it in order to get anything done. You just keep sawing and sawing and sawing, and you don't sharpen the saw. You're working against yourself at some point. That's not my analogy. That's a Stephen Covey thing from years ago. So first of all, no guilt. If you need to hit pause, if you need to go work at another church and take less responsibility, because as you have discovered, especially the last 12 months, if you're at the point of the spear, the headwinds are fierce. And one of the reasons, you know, people think ministry is easy and they want to jump in and they want to be a lead pastor and they want to plant a church is they've never been the point of the spear. And once they step out in the front, it's like, wait, nobody prepared me for this. So if you're tired, it's probably, you know, you may be doing everything you could possibly do. You may be pastoring perfectly, but it's just time for a break. So if you're at the point of exhaustion, don't sacrifice your family. Don't sacrifice your health. You're in this for a lifetime of ministry, and anything that extends your life and possibly extend your ministry is valid as long as it's legal and it's not going to, hurt you physically or you're going to regret it later. Because as you know, the more exhausted we get, the more temptable we are and the more prone we are for the illegitimate ways of expressing our frustration. So please don't allow yourself to get there. There is no shame. There is no guilt. Second, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, our exhaustion is due to the fact that we are doing things we're no good at and we're not geared and wired to do. If I had to do one-on-one counseling 8 hours a day, I would get out of the ministry. Probably because nobody would come to see me either, because I'm terrible at that. But it's exhausting to me. So trying to figure out where you make the greatest contribution to your church and marrying that with something that gives you life and energy, the more you do of what gives you life, the more life you're going to have for the ministry. There are always things we don't want to do or don't enjoy doing, but when that becomes predominant, when that dominates our time and emotion, it just wears us out. So look at what you're doing. There may be some balls you're juggling that you just need to let hit the floor and roll over in the corner and hope somebody comes and picks those up. But here's the thing. Your fully exploited strengths are your greatest contribution to your church. And when you get so busy doing so many things that you can no longer focus on your strength, you begin to wing it and you begin trying to give energy to things you're never going to be good at. And again, that's easy for me to say where I'm sitting. I know that. But a long, long time ago, I had to learn that the hard way, like a lot of leaders do. So find what gives you energy, figure out how to schedule more of that into your schedule. But if at the end of the day, you're done, it is okay to be done. No guilt, no shame. Get healthy, and then maybe God will give you another opportunity. I have a feeling that he will.
Andy, that's so helpful. Trying to realize your goal without losing your soul. It's not worth losing your marriage. It's not worth losing your health over. I love that.
No.
That just gives freedom. Thank you so much. That's great. Listen, we said we'd do an hour, and I'm sure you've got many other things to go on for. We have over 100 questions. So we could go on for another hour plus talking about those questions. So if you want some of those questions answered, let me encourage you to join the leadership cohort, because we'll talk about some of these things. We'll give answers to these questions. Andy's staff are going to help us on that as well. So make sure you get signed up for that today. And the first 25 people, like I say, will get a copy of Andy's book to download. If you want to carry on following us, Further Faster Network, you can subscribe to our email on our website. And once a month, you'll get an email with some resources and some inspiration from us. Follow us on the socials. We live online. We're there on Instagram and Facebook, and we'd love to have a conversation about this with you online as well. But it just, to finish, I just want to say, Andy, thank you. This has been the most brilliant hour I've had for a long time. I feel like I'm walking away. You know what it's like at a Thanksgiving dinner or a Christmas dinner when you've had a massive meal and you push away from the table and you make that strange noise? It kind of feels like that. So you've just filled my leadership bucket up to overflowing, and I'm really, really grateful. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Duncan. This was a lot of fun, and God bless all of you who are out there leading a local church. It's the greatest thing to do, but it's never an easy thing to do because we're dealing with broken people just like we're broken people. So thank you for this opportunity.